In a world filled with chaos and a myriad of risks, there is opportunity. You're listening to Riding the Wave, project management for emergency managers, where we discuss how we adapt and rise above those rolling waves of hazards and threats we face, and rise to the top. And now, your host, the president of Pinnacle Performance Management, Andrew Boyarsky.
I have as my guest today, Thomas Croall. Thomas is working in the UK and internationally. He's a seasoned expert in business continuity, crisis management, and emergency management with a proven track record in both the public sector and financial industry. He's led significant projects, including the Rail Resilience Review for UK rail infrastructure. Thomas is recognized both for his contributions to major incident planning and has been an influential figure in international standards development, specifically on emergency management capability assessment and public warning. And he's commended for his leadership in the field. I'm also very honored to say, and pleased to say, he's a close colleague of mine and a fellow alum of the Hult International Business School. So thank you very much for joining the podcast, Thomas.
Thank you, Andrew. It's very kind of you to invite me, and nice to be talking with you again.
Well, I know that there's a lot for us to discuss, and I'll start off on the topic of resilience in the post-pandemic situation, since I know, we were sort of ensconced for a number of years at home. So, and before we explore some other areas of resilience, how would you define the term resilience in organizations?
I was having this debate with a colleague the other day, and we were discussing the difference between operational resilience and organizational resilience. Mm-hmm. And I think that differentiation has existed in the field of risk, operational risk, and other types of risk like financial and strategic risk for a long time. Almost a separation that financial risks like liquidity failings and capital failings that caused the financial crisis, they put many organizations and economies out of business, so to speak. So is that resilience? In one sense. Mm-hmm. Societal resilience, definitely. Economic resilience, financial resilience. It's not entirely operational resilience that most business continuity managers or emergency managers would think about, but there's a relationship between the two, right? An interplay. Cause and effect. Mm-hmm. So the tricky thing is with this word resilience, it's becoming such a commonly used term in the media and our vocab these days. But the tricky thing is, where do you draw the line between what is resilience and what is just doing good business, managing an organization well? Mm-hmm. So for me, I personally, again, back to the kind of the practitioner view of emergency management and operational kind of resilience. I think of it in that operational guise, and to just put some scope boundaries, but you can't not work with your colleagues across the organization if you're going to be doing it well. I remember during the actual pandemic putting a small article out there on LinkedIn, and I think I called it fair weather business models. Mm-hmm. And I think there's many companies reflecting on this more. And as I look at the background that's behind you now and the name of your podcast, Riding the Wave, we know that during COVID, there were many organizations that were able to ride the wave because they pivoted. They're able to take advantage of the new kind of societal paradigm, switch to digital if they weren't already, double down on that. And they were literally riding the wave. There were others that had some sort of buoy that's just keeping the head above water. Mm. And then thirdly, there were those that sadly didn't have the capital, didn't have the operational capacity, didn't have the culture or the mindset, and were severely impacted. And some of those businesses went out of business during COVID.
I wanted to address what's commonly being discussed, and that is, what is the relationship between resilience, business continuity, emergency management, and disaster recovery? And after I just said those three, I'm thinking probably the order, we're talking about emergency management, business continuity, and disaster recovery, which, each are related, the last three, and how they interplay. but the sort of umbrella has been resilience, right? So how do you relate these various concepts to one another?
Almost in a tongue-in-cheek way, by saying they are the same concept, and what keeps them different is terminology and sectoral and organizational cultures, frankly. At the end of the day, anybody embarking in any one of those fields is managing a risk, a bad thing happening, trying to manage it down by preventing it, on the assumption that its impact will be severe to extreme, so it can't be completely eradicated, needing to then seek to control it in some way via response plans, detective controls and response plans. And I suppose the biggest difference is who is the constituency and what are the assets you're trying to protect. Business continuity is the term commonly used in the financial services and private sector. But business continuity, I know in the more North America, it manifests as continuity of operations, COOP, in the public sector. But that's just keeping the BAU going whilst to ensure that you can deliver core services to people, because the impact could be manifest financially, reputationally, and also life and safety. So I think the biggest separation really is cultural and terminology wise. At a conceptual level, they're the same thing. The tools and techniques to approach them, a lot of similarity again. And I think if we do go as far as saying they are separate disciplines, I think they would definitely benefit from sharing more of those tools and techniques and integration of thinking better. Because look, the bad things that we're seeking to manage don't respect our geographic or jurisdictional boundaries or what we call something.
On that point, one of the things that we see is, in our post-pandemic world is, greater level of risks, increasing civil unrest that's taking place. We've seen an uptick in the number of cyber attacks, especially with the war going on in Gaza and in northern Israel and Lebanon. How are corporations addressing resilience in this current situation with increasing risk factors that they're facing?
So it depends on the sector. I think there's many organizations that are still are operating, as I referred to in my previous answer. They're still operating fair weather business models and hoping it'll never happen. But can you blame them to some extent because of economic pressures and cost of living implications that's very apparent across the Western world? So with resources very tight, it is difficult to make the case to start thinking about bad things that might happen. But as you pointed out eloquently in your question, these bad things are happening more and more in an interconnected way. And I think that's the point, the interconnected way. Society now is so interdependent from a systems perspective on supply chains, whether they be for physical goods, but also digital, because there's so much we outsource now to third parties in that digital supply chain. So I think it is ringing true for some sectors, and the thing that's making it ring true is regulatory pressure, especially in financial services. We're seeing in the UK, the financial services regulators, the Bank of England and the Financial Conduct Authority have some very robust and stringent approaches now to operational resilience, and we're seeing the same apply across Europe with the CER, Critical Entities Resilience Regulations, the Digital Operational Resilience Act, DORA, and I think there's similar moves being made in North America with coming out of the SEC for exchange-traded businesses. So those regulatory pressures, I think, are government starting to wake up to the need to regulate what I talked about before as operational disruptions in a way that they haven't had to before.
Yeah. So there was a report yesterday by, I think it was issued by the FBI. They had basically, thwarted a major attack by Russian hackers, most likely state actors, to infect small and medium-sized businesses that are tertiary suppliers to some of the main, sort of vendors, that are part of the critical infrastructure in the United States. And this was after a similar line of attack by suspected Chinese government operators to target critical infrastructure. So they're trying to go after sort of the outer ring, so to speak, so that they could try to then penetrate into central systems, so to speak.
And here's the thing: when you start looking across our professions, you asked me about business continuity, crisis management, emergency management, and a lot of the way that we approach these technical disciplines is from a response stance. The bad thing has happened. How do we now respond? Well, actually now, when especially on cybersecurity, you have to almost have a stance where you assume your perimeter has been breached. So you've got to be able to detect well. But what really makes the difference is basic cyber hygiene and organizational hygiene in the way that you manage your organization. I was talking, you talked about small to medium enterprises. I was talking to my mortgage broker the other day, who works for a medium-sized financial services mortgage broking company. And I said, look, if you had a ransomware attack tomorrow, we were just generally chatting, how would you know how to contact me? Would you have access to my file? Would my mortgage fall through? My house purchase fall through? And for those smaller businesses, a response plan can be as simple as just having client telephone numbers available when you need them to manage the expectations of your clients and your customers. Just basic communications tooling, basic security, and the way that you manage your IT, you manage your passwords. I mean, we can go on quite a deep rabbit hole on cyber here, but I think the same applies to all types of threats, whether it be severe weather. Are you doing preventative maintenance on your building so the roof's not going to blow off in certain wind speeds? So we need to find that balance as an industry, I think, advocating the prevention, but being capable for the response.
So one of the things that having read pieces of both your review and the recommendations report, we're going to get to that in a little bit later in our discussion here, is
this is the rail work that I've been doing recently. Correct.
How is risk management, perhaps we might refer to this as enterprise risk management, which is much more of a modern approach, much more broader and more inclusive, looking at the sort of panoply of risks, not just sort of operational risks, financial risks, those sorts of things. And for those who are unsure about what I'm talking about as far as enterprise risk management, please go back, look at some of my previous podcasts, as there's a lot of information, a lot that I've covered on enterprise risk management. And you can also Google it and find out more. As a little plug for my colleagues who work at the Risk Management Society, there's a whole treasure trove that they've published on enterprise risk management. So how is that being integrated into emergency management and continuity programs?
Can I almost switch your question there, Andrew, and say, how is emergency management and then continuity programs hooking into the organization's risk management practices? Because I would say more often than not, most sizable organizations have robust risk management practices in place that link into their organizational and corporate governance requirements, the way things get reported to senior management, the way things get reported to the board, and the way the organization gets generally governed. So I think the work that I've been doing that you refer to in recent years has been with the railway industry across the United Kingdom, doing a review of emergency management and its effectiveness. And I think if I was to step back and almost give the headline points, everything that you would expect from an emergency management perspective gets done, to lesser or greater extent from organization to organization, different train company or infrastructure manager, but they're doing all of the key activities. And if you were to go and look at any of those activities in isolation, you would say, oh, great, that's working. But as soon as you step back and you try and take a systems look, and the integrated emergency management approach is what we try to do in the review, and we try to see how are these parts integrating to make meaningful sense. You don't exercise for the sake of it. You exercise to validate a capability. You don't have a capability for the sake of it. You have a capability that will respond to a risk. You don't manage a risk for the sake of it. You manage a risk because the impact of that risk manifesting will have a negative consequence. And more importantly, actually, because historically a lot of risk management has been about how do we protect the organization, but from almost a kind of a mindset shift of that risk management now is how do we manage that risk down to limit the consequences to the end user, whether they be a member of the public, whether they be a client or a customer, or the overall market or industry integrity. This is especially relevant for critical national infrastructure. So whether it be power, transport, water utility supplies, health, for example, they're all part of an integrated society. So the analogy that I found to almost try and bring this issue to life is that when we looked at the industry, we saw that all of the jigsaw pieces were there on the table. Some of those jigsaw pieces were neatly clicked together in the right way. Some of those jigsaw pieces had been jammed together and they weren't supposed to go together. And some of the jigsaw pieces were just absolutely out of alignment. Every jigsaw piece was there, but were they put together in the right way to tell you what the picture was? And the picture is, what's that risk exposure and how have we managed it down to a level that is within our organizational risk appetite and within the appetite of the society that we're serving and might judge us.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And then I suppose the added test almost of that is to ask yourself if something very bad had happened. And in the UK in recent years, we had the Manchester Arena bombing. Mm-hmm. We've had some major train derailment in Scotland. And we've had various other incidents, and these types of incidents, they go to public inquiry where scrutiny is put on them. And then, of course, COVID. We have a national inquiry that's going on at the moment into the country's operational and political response to COVID. So if you are at that point, having to sit in front of the inquirer, at one of these, I suppose the equivalent to you would be in North America would be some sort of Senate hearing, I assume. If you were to be sitting there, could you hand on heart say we did everything in the right way to manage the risk down in a transparent and informed manner?
So a colleague of mine on that note has made recommendations, and I believe that actually implementing it sort of on a national level when there are major incidents, that it's required that we actually review how they were responded to. We have, let's say, an incidents of major national importance that we do that, because we do have in the United States the National Transportation Safety Board. It's called the NTSB, that goes and investigates major accidents that happen and looking at why did they occur and study them and study all aspects. It's
we have an equivalent in the UK, the Rail Accident Investigation Board, RAIB.
Right, but now they're looking at how do we do this on a national level so that we can learn those lessons and actually enhance our resilience overall. Indeed. Of course, most jurisdictions in the United States, as part of being integrated into a national emergency management, what we call the National Emergency Management Framework that comes out of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, is required typically to do an after-action review and improvement plan as a standard protocol. So,
and I suppose the very important point on that is that shouldn't be years down the line. That should be akin to a hot debrief, so we can learn rapid lessons. That doesn't mean it's rushed, but it shouldn't be delayed by bureaucracy. There should be almost stages. So one thing that's very interesting, there's a lot of public debate around the UK's COVID inquiry at the moment, is that they're releasing it in almost chapters. working through different topics. So it's not a 5-year inquiry with one big at the report at the end. So any learnings can be identified and learned as soon as possible.
That's a really good point. In actual, so I was at a conference earlier this week, and one of the points that was brought out by one of the presenters is we need to focus on that hot wash and on that initial hot wash, because my experience has been that when after the fact, individuals will start to think about, how do I package this in a way where there are fewer political ramifications for me and my boss or people on my team. Indeed. That it doesn't blow back on us. Well, the point is, when we do these after action reviews, it's supposed to be done in a no fault environment. But we all know there are political and legal ramifications for all of this. And in the reality of the situation, if we can actually take those critical learnings and start applying them immediately, we can benefit from them. So not that we shouldn't try to look at the whole and try to make systemic changes. Those are, of course, longer term, require a lot more will and resources to make those changes. So I want to then pivot now to the Rail Resilience Project emergency management review that you did. And you mentioned this, I think, a great analogy of the jigsaw puzzle problem. And so I want to, in addition to that, could you discuss some of the key findings and recommendations from that report? I know, so for those who are interested, I will publish a link on here to the publicly available document that you so, I'd say so thoroughly did. This is going back now a year or so. 2021. So we're talking about 2 years. So there's a longer one, but what were some of the key findings and recommendations from that?
So I suppose it's that point about hooking into organizational governance. So we want to bring emergency management out of this back office activity that's not thought about by the day-to-day organization and its managers and middle management and top management level. Because when you have a somewhat safety critical industry like rail or transport in general, it doesn't necessarily need to be just rail. I'm sure this applies to aviation and other forms and modes of transport. There is a very, very strong culture of safety. And you can almost see that as a very kind of low level incidents, slips, trips, falls, kind of medium size incidents. Inherently, transport's going to get delayed. So they have to have a response capability. So culturally, that leads to almost we can do it kind of mentality, because we go through it regularly. The question you have to ask yourself is, does that scale to the large events? Similarly, the industry, again, I think aviation is a key one for this, but also rail. In the UK, rail industry heavily regulated for security purposes. So it's very good at managing counterterrorism type threats by virtue of the regulation that exists, puts resources into it. So very good at low level health and safety, very good at big security incidents. But what about this space up here? All these other threats and hazards. We talk in emergency management, and I know it's commonly done in the US as well, about taking an all threats and all hazards approach. The biggest analogy of that, please do correct me if I'm wrong on this, and I'm sure some of your listeners may want to comment on this, but as an outside observer, looking towards North America in the early noughties, we saw a shift in the mechanics of governmental response to emergencies post 9/11, shifting FEMA more towards Department of Homeland Security, and everything became very counterterrorism centric. And then it was not so many years after that that Hurricane Katrina happened, and there was lots of failings in capability. And that maybe I'm not an entirely formed commentator on this, but that may be because they took a very security focused view and took their eye off the all hazards, all threats mantra. So I think that applies still in many sectors. So one of the findings was step back, and without any pre-assumptions, assess the risk. Use diverse sources to assess that risk, and then take a proportional risk-based approach to it in the deployment of those preventative controls and the responsive. But really, really importantly, and I think this is the key other finding, that you have to know that at any point in time, those controls are still operating effectively. It's all well and good to have deployed them in an effective manner, but unless you're testing them on a regular basis, how do you know they're effective? And one of the ways that we do that is emergency management exercises. That works for the responsive controls. It's not always robustly done for the preventative controls and the detective controls. So when we started looking at exercising, as I said, all the jigsaw pieces were there, exercising got done. But again, quite commonly, when a lot of the standards out there, whether it be the business continuity international standards or the equivalent on emergency management standards, or even the legislation says you must do regular emergency management exercises. To most people's mind, that defaults to once a year. The choice of threat or hazard that gets exercised in any one scenario is usually what's flavour of the month with those that are participating. Is it a true representation of all the threats and hazards? And I would ask an organisation, how do you know you're doing the right exercises and the right amount? If you've got two risks that really trip your threshold of being the ones that you're most concerned about, maybe it's just two. But if you have 5 different threats that all have the same level of impact, maybe you need to be testing all 5 of those threats in discrete exercises. And then another point is organizational change. It's great to do crisis management exercises, but commonly, I'm sure many of your listeners will have experienced this themselves. You run an exercise, you come back the following year hoping to build upon that, the competency, that the groundwork has been set in year 1, and you're going to come back and it's going to be additive and you're going to mature the team's capability, only to find that at least 50% of the participants have moved on into new roles or new organizations. So you're back to square one. So there's a balance to be found between these kind of big bang exercises and versus a little and often, where you're giving top management regular exposure to or ongoing training and a small amount of stress testing, essentially. And I think organizations can't make that decision about what's right unless they've stepped back and look at what are the risks we're trying to manage.
It's a good point, and it's an excellent point that you make. And this is one that I have had conversations with, clients and with colleagues. Is how do we actually maintain and sustain these capabilities? It's one thing to actually build a system and build, a system that includes, the staff, the stuff, the spaces, and the support infrastructure. But as you point out, if you have attrition and you don't have that, transition that takes place, that briefing and that institutional knowledge that we maintain, how is that capability maintained in the out years? And I've seen many, actual applications that have been sunsetted that were quite useful. Applications that were built, quite frankly, in response to a pandemic response, really great ones, and then suddenly mothballed and put aside. And then when the time comes, we need something that we can actually use. Oh, it's not there. Why? Because it wasn't maintained, it wasn't supported, funding wasn't, provided, so that, with new server systems, basically we, it's configured appropriately and things like that. So,
and did the people managing that capability, that program, even know what it was there to do, why it was implemented in the first place? You talk about that, or that corporate, that organizational knowledge. Is there a pass down of that? There's a concept of Chesterton's fence. I think I'm quoting that. We can make sure we put a link connected to it if I've got this wrong. But if you're driving down a country road nothing around you at all, but then you come to a wall with a gate, and that gate is closed, and you go through it. Should you close that gate again? You ask yourself, why was that gate there in the first place? It's stopping people moving through, but it's almost incumbent on you to say, why was that gate put there? What is it stopping getting through?
Mm-hmm.
And don't just arbitrarily dismiss it. We all too often, when our organizations try to make resource cuts and operational efficiencies, we sometimes forget why those measures, those ways of doing things were put there in the first place. And part of being one of the ways an organization can become resilient is by building redundancy into its resources, redundancy into its time frame and the way that it processes things. So if something does go awry, it has a little bit of redundancy to pick up the slack before causing the impact to its end users. But in a drive to find organizational efficiency, it's all too easy to get rid of that redundancy because nobody was there to say, hey, we put that in because we had this incident where that happened, and then we realized we needed that redundancy in case it might ever happen again.
Yep, that's a very good point. It's interesting because I've had discussions with certain folks around, we need to be able to go back to very basic paper, what we call, POTS, plain old telephone system. I still have a landline in my home, which rings every once in a while. And I've had my own children at home wonder about how am I going to make calls to my friends using a cell phone. And I say, hey, there's a wired phone that you could also use. So it's there for a reason. And to your point, I mean, there's a reason that we want to have some levels of redundancy that's there. But yes, just-in-time systems, cost cutting, those are sort of the enemies of this. So
don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that efficiency isn't good. We talked earlier in the conversation about cost and resource pressures for organizations. So one of the recommendations of the rail work we talked about and some of the documentation we've now created for the industry is about the concept of resilience by design and resilience through change, and interlocking the concept of resilience into resource and financial decision making. So it is not an afterthought. It's actually one of the considerations. It doesn't mean it's the primary consideration. It means it should just be considered in a informed and transparent way at the time the organization is working out how it's going to manage itself and operate.
But I want to point out the paradox, right? Of course, that I think we both would agree, and that is, when we do our emergency planning, we build those capabilities and we have those resources. We're asking the public basically to spend money on things that they don't want to happen and can't imagine happening. Especially with politicians who are trying to, save tax-paying dollars. We don't want to spend money that we don't want to. We want to, we don't want to add money. But when an emergency happens, having that there is absolutely mission critical at the point that we need it. So that's.
Frankly, I know you do work with universities, I think there is definitely a space for practitioners in this field to work a lot more with whether it be private research interests or with academic institutions to frankly work out what is the return on investment. We know the frequency of disruptive events is increasing because of the interconnected world we live in now. And when I've gone looking for it, I found very little informed research that talks about for every pound spent, this is what you get back. For every dollar spent, this is what you get back when it comes to resilience. And that's what I mean about considering resilience when making financial decisions. If we use a comparator, I think for every dollar spent on mosquito nets, it's exponential kind of benefit in saving human welfare and saving lives. There's a lot of money that we spend on other charitable endeavors, but mosquito nets are one of the best bang for buck, so to speak, in managing down risk. we need to be thinking in the same way when we invest in resilience. And some of those activities we can do, back to my point earlier about basic hygiene, especially on the cyber front, just managing your passwords and doing simple things like keeping your systems patched, updated, and having antivirus, such simple things that have very little cost implication, but go a very long way in managing down that exposure.
Absolutely. I wanted to get to the RDG guidance note, the Rail Emergency Code of Practice that was recently released. How was that received, and how is it being implemented?
So it's one of a series of documents that we have been working on with other companies have been working on as well for the UK rail industry. They're a form of self-regulation, codes of practice, and what they do is we've tried to take the findings from the review that was done in 2021 and try and translate those into a set of how emergency management can be done in that integrated way, where the puzzle pieces all join together and we can see the picture, and then importantly, how integrated emergency management links into governance, the governance at organizational level and the governance at industry level. So we can start doing things like self-assessment of capability. So we can start producing management information that says how good a job are we actually doing at emergency management, and hopefully making a meaningful difference for passengers and rail users. So the specific document that I've been working on with colleagues is on the anticipation, assessment and prevention of emergency management risk, which really tries to enshrine a lot of what we've been talking about in this conversation in a robust all threats and hazards way, identify your exposure to disruptive events, and then take an informed, contextualized understanding of how you might prevent and respond. And one thing that's really important in doing so is know who the end users are and what the impact might be to them if the bad thing manifests. How is it going to affect those stranded passengers? And this really, I think, is one of the biggest shifts that's now happening in our field. I'll call it resilience in general, is and especially coming through from the financial services regulators. It's about asking the banks and the insurance companies to get out of their own heads and ask, if we have a disruption, how is it going to impact our customers? And how is it going to impact our vulnerable customers? If you have a customer that is unemployed, receiving state benefits, is living a subsistence lifestyle, has dependents in the household, whether it's elderly family or children, and they are dependent on that payment coming into their bank account and they can't buy food, then that's very quickly causing intolerable harm, as the regulation talks about it. So that's a very different mindset to, this is going to cost us X million on the balance sheet and reputational damage. No, it's actually, what tangible harm is it going to cause to the end user? And I think that needs to flow more into other industries. In a previous travel company I worked for, they talked about putting the passenger first. And I think that particular company did, but there's many organizations out there that make these statements as lip service, but haven't really thought about it from a customer experience perspective when the disruption is happening.
Yep. I'm sure you may have seen in the news, I know you're on the other side of the pond, as we like to say, but how some of the airlines, specifically Southwest airline in the United States, was fined as a result of delays that they allowed to manifest. And we're talking about millions of dollars that they were fined by the US government for failure to meet certain service standards.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's just one example of how it's coming more to the fore, this thinking. One approach that I would like to see more is, I'd like to see collaboration between emergency managers and resilience professionals with customer experience professionals. Now, those customer experience professionals are usually spending a lot of their time designing the customer journey and working out how to delight the customer, whether it be the way that they interact with the app, whether the way that the person answers the phone, whether the way that the box sounds and feels when you open it. You get your new Apple product out and it makes a certain noise, and they have a expertise in delighting the customer, but they also have that deep kind of almost psychological, sociological understanding of the customer. So one of the common terminology in their profession is about happy path and unhappy path. Happy path is everything goes right, the product or the service as we designed it meets the needs of the customer and hopefully delights them. Unhappy path is where something goes wrong for the customer. It might be a delayed train. It might be there's an erroneous transaction on the bank account that the customer has to call up about and go through some sort of complaints process. They're almost the business as usual bad things going wrong. When we talk about emergencies and business continuity events, we're talking almost like the extreme bad things happening. So you've got your happy path, your unhappy path, and your extreme unhappy path.
Yes.
So how could we then create a persona of a customer going through that extreme unhappy path? What are they experiencing as they try to interact with our organization and are not receiving the services that they need? And some of those services very important to preserving their safety and welfare.
That's a great point, and I'm gonna put a pin in that one for a future discussion that we can have. I think there's more to mine there, and I whenever I have conversations with you, Thomas, I always walk away better educated. So,
thank you. Thank you.
It's a rich discussion. So I want to thank you very much for taking some time aside to speak to me and to our listeners in the podcast. And we look forward to having you on at some point again in the future.
Thank you. And hopefully we can do it in person. You can come to Scotland. Or
I will gladly do that, and then we can.
There we go. That sounds good. And if any of your listeners want to reach out to me, then I welcome any LinkedIn connections.
I will put your contact information into the podcast, so that people can actually see it. They can click on that link and reach out to you. Again, we speaking to Thomas Croall. Thomas is based in the UK. He also works not only in the UK, but internationally. He's an expert in business continuity, crisis management, and emergency management. He's done a whole host of work with the national rail, financial industry, and government as well. So thank you once again.
Thank you, Andrew.
In a world where emergencies are becoming increasingly complex and varied, the need for effective coordination and planning has never been more paramount. Enter the Project Management for Emergency Managers workshop. This unique online learning experience is designed to equip you with the tools and strategies to streamline your emergency management efforts. Over the course of 6 engaging weekend sessions, we delve deep into the principles of project management, tailored specifically for your needs as an emergency manager. Learn the skills needed to navigate the complexities of emergency management.
You've been listening to Riding the Wave, hosted by Andrew Boyarsky, President of Pinnacle Performance Management and Clinical Associate Professor in Emergency and Project Management at NYU and John Jay College.